Hello everyone. In this video today I wanna talk about memory. Memory is our subject matter for chapter 11. Firstly, as you notice, we are talking about cognitive subjects such as attention, perception, information processing, and memory systems. And we will talk about intelligence in chapter 12 and 13 inshallah. These are cognitive subjects, cognitive perspectives. When we say cognitive subjects, as you have already known, then we are talking about intellectual processes. These processes happen inside the individual's brain to process and explain the stimuli. Stimuli such as auditory, visual, and other stimuli that are coming by our senses. But not all of them, not all information will be understood. The stimuli are what the individual has been paid attention to them to be understandable by our brain. By what process? By the process of perception. When we can interpret these information, then we will talk about perception for what? For not all information that we are receiving, but for the information that the human being has been paid attention to, then the result we can deal successfully with our world and the achievement for adaptation with our environment. Now, when we talk about memory, we have to talk about information processing model, information processing perspective. Okay, نموذج معالجة المعلومات. Information processing model emphasizes on thought processes, reasoning, the way information is encountered, and on the function of the memory. So that information processing, it's a cognitive model that studied the memory. Okay, this is the relationship between memory and information processing model. This model studies the nature of memory, the components of memory. Yes, now unlike the behaviorists, reward is not as such necessary for learning. So that information process model assumes that human being behaviors aren't controlled with the specific stimulus or consequences of these behaviors as the major principle of behaviorism or behavioral theories. But behaviors on information process model, the behaviors are the result of serial cognitive processes that mediate between receiving stimuli and producing appropriate response to these stimuli. Yes? And the process of information processing or the operation of information processing depends on the nature and characteristics of three memory systems. So that we are talking about cognitive issues, okay? We talk about information processing model that studies the memory, yes, unlike the behaviorist, reward is not as such necessary for learning. Reward or desirable consequences is not as such necessary for learning. But here the most important thing, contrasting with the reward, contrasting with the desirable thing, are the learner's goals and expectations, experiences. So that the message here is to tell you that cognitive processes are the most important for the learning and the learner, and for your responses. They are responsible for the human being reaction, the human being responses, yes, and for adaptation and understanding the world. This is because of the cognitive perspectives, the cognitive theories rejected the principle of behavioral theories that assumes our behaviors are controlled with the consequences. Look here, most important are learners' goals, expectations, and experiences that require cognitive processes. Experiences now include exploration and discovering of the environment to formulate one's own cognitive map and understanding how the world operates. Here, experiences which are stored in our mind as a cognitive map, we already have talked about in Piaget theory of cognitive development. We talked about assimilation and accommodation processes, and how through these processes we construct and build our schemas as a cognitive map. Why? To understand how the world operates. We have to talk about memory. The definition of memory provides the first indication of its importance in our lives. Memory is the processes involved in retaining, retrieving, and using information about stimuli, images, events, ideas, and skills after the original information is no longer present. In other words, memory means a process, active process, or a controlled process by which the person retain, this means keep information, keep images, events, ideas in his mind, and retrieve these information, recalling these information as the time of need. Then the meaning for it is a process involved retaining, retrieving, using information. Apply for information, using information when the original information is no longer present. Then the question how memory works. One tactic cognitive psychologists have used is to create models like a model proposed by Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. This means that there is a model that shows the work and the nature of memory, stages of memory, components of memory to be understandable. There were a lot of models that were being proposed in the 1960s, but this model for Atkinson and Shiffrin, which is called model of memory, included many of the features of memory models. Okay, the reason behind this label model of memory is the inclusion for many of the features of memory models that were being proposed in the 1960s. This model became extremely influential and shaped research on memory for many years. It was extremely important, essential, clear, and influential, and shaped research on memory. The stages in the model are called the structural features of the model. These structural features include the stages of memory as this. The first stage of memory, sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, STM here, and LTM for long-term memory. In other words, our information that that are our information and knowledge that are passing from our sensory to our brain to be kept and to be retained, okay, retain will pass in these stages: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The model of Atkinson and Shiffrin is called a model of memory because it included many of the features of memory models that were being proposed in 1960s. This indicates that there were a lot of models that studied or that had studied the memory, but the most important, the most influential model is this model of memory for Atkinson and Shiffrin. This model became extremely influential and shaped research of memory for many years. The stages in the model are called the structural feature of the model. Structural features show the stages of memory. The first stage or the first kind is sensory memory. The second is short-term memory. The third is long-term memory. Atkinson and Shiffrin also described the memory system as including control processes. These control processes are active processes that can be controlled by the person and may differ from one task to another. In other words, there are control processes that a human being use these control processes to what? To retain information, to keep information, to store information in his or her mind, and retrieve this information at the time of need. Then there are control processes that help human beings' mind to retain, to keep, to store information, knowledge, images, events in his or her mind. Control processes. These control processes represented by the rehearsal processes. It's the meaning of rehearsal. Rehearsal is repeating a stimulus over and over. If you want to keep any information, any number, any stimulus, then you try to repeat this more and more to store, to retain this information in your cognitive map. This called you are make a control process. Control process to make information stored in the mind. This is the first control process or the first strategy. The first control processes and the first strategy to store our information in our memory. Rehearsal means repeating. The other examples of control processes are what? Here, look here, relating the numbers in the phone, relating the stimulus that you want to keep it in your mind with what? With any stimulus, another stimulus with any information, familiar familiar number for you, familiar place, linking words, for examples, clues, any site, any place, any event. You make a relating connection, connecting the stimulus you want to store and retain in your mind, with the familiar things. The third strategy is attention, that help you focus on information that is particularly important or interesting for you. So that we have until now three strategies that helps our mind to store and help our memory to store and retain the information or any stimuli. The first is rehearsal process. The second is relating. The third one is attention process. These processes also called mnemonic devices in psychology or in cognitive psychology. mnemonic معينات الذاكرة that helps the memory to store and retain information. Now let's move our slide to the model of Atkinson and Shiffrin to show the stages and the components of our memory. Stages of our memory. The first is sensory memory. Second is short-term memory and long-term memory. Yes, we want to explain or to understand these three stages. Now look to this diagram, the model of memory for Atkinson and Shiffrin. There is an input here. Input represents the stimulus or information, knowledge, images, events, okay, coming from external environment. These input will go to our sensory memory, then to short-term memory, after that, or the last path to long-term memory. Now, please return back to the sensory memory. Sensory memory, from its name, sensory, by our senses. So that activation, the activation is less than a second. Less than a second. The duration or the period of time that information be stored here, less than a second. But if human beings pay attention to this information, focus on this information, these information will transfer and go to our short-term memory. But the same result of if human beings don't pay attention, don't focus on these information will be go away because because Atkinson and Shiffrin focus for the activation of this type of memory, short-term memory. The activation, the level of activation in this memory is roughly 1 minute. Yes, for not longer than 30 seconds. Not longer for what? Not longer than 30 seconds. Yes, now please look to these errors. Yes, opposite errors. Yes, the first one is go to long-term memory. The second is come from long-term memory to short-term memory. Now, if human beings or individuals pay attention and focus and make processing for information, he may use what rehearsal, relating, and paying attention or pays attention and focusing for this information. Then what? Then this information will go and transfer to the long-term memory. Okay, all right. This go from long-term memory, okay, to short-term memory indicate that our output, our responses, our behaviors, our our information that are stored in our mind will come from short-term memory. This is and because the short-term memory called working memory. Yes, so that the activation in sensory memory is less than a second. The duration or the level of activation, duration, period of time. Yes, for short-term memory, for not longer than 30 seconds. Yeah, this means 1 minute. But what about the duration for the information or stimulus to be stored in a long-term memory? The level of activation here is yes, is indefinite period of time. Yes, so that information never go away from long-term memory. Everything will be stored and retained for indefinite time forever. Yes, the short-term memory, when we want to recall the information or the stimuli that we already have have stored have stored in long-term memory, we will use short-term memory. So that short-term memory is responsible for the recalling response in the memory work. Yes, let's move to the next slide. Stage model of memory. We want to talk about the stage model of memory in details. The stage model of memory consists of separate stages. These are sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Storage stages. Information flows through the system with recoding operating at each stage. Sensory memory stage called immediate memory. Some psychologists call it the visual information store, VIS. Others call it as an echoic store. This represents what the representation form that occurs here. The stage model of memory consists of separate stages. These are sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. Storage stages. Information flows through the system with recording operating at each stage. This means that our information that coming from the external environment to be kept, to be retained. Yes, to be retained. This means that information will pass through these stages. And stimuli will pass through these stages to be kept and stored in our memory. The representation forms are two here in this kind of memory. The first is a visual information stored or visual sensory. The second is what is it auditory sensory. The first visual sensory, it receives the real sight and pictures and represents them as a shape of imagination, which is stored and retained as image. This is called what? Iconic store, iconic sensory, iconic memory. Yes. Then the second kind is auditory. It receives the auditory stimulus and the characteristics of sounds, so that it's called what? The echoic memory. As we said here in short-term memory, if the information and the stimuli are rehearsed and processed, it will transfer and move to short-term memory. Short-term memory will make processing to these sensory processing, visual, auditory, and motor manipulation, and sensory depicts. Yes, for all these stimuli, short-term memory will process these kind of stimuli, sensory stimuli. It's related to the ability to retain information just long enough to use it. The duration is about 1 minute, not longer than 1 or 30 seconds, right? It's the memory involved in retaining a telephone number just long enough to dial it after looking it in a directory. This means you will forget the number, the telephone number, after you after you dial it, because short-term memory, its activation or level of activation is 1 minute. Let's move to the next slide, please. Short-term memory contained material which needed to be kept in store for not longer than 30 seconds. The capacity of this store is limited to 7 plus or minus 2 items, letters, or even longer units of information like words of chunks. 7 plus or minus, 7 plus or minus means that you will retain items, letters, okay, from 5 to 9. 5 to 9. 7 plus minus 2, you have or you will retain and keep in your mind, keep in your memory items, letters, numbers from 5 to 9. There is something here, longer units of information like words or chunks. What's the meaning of chunks? Chunks are coming from the chunking process. This process made why to enhance the retaining process and the retaining the information in our mind, and to increase the capacity to short-term memory to process information and retain it, keep it, store it in our mind. For phone numbers, for examples, names, concepts. Chunking. In chunking process, we collect the groups of information in a specific order to give one group via the collocation principles. Yes, for example, I have a lot of numbers such as 6, 1, 5, 8, 9, 7, 2, 3, 0. I will make groups for these information to be kept easily and to enhance our memory, so that we are making grouping or regrouping for the stimulus, for the stimuli, for the serial of numbers, many numbers, letters, for example, concepts, names, letters, etc. I will make groups. When you make groups for numbers, yes, you will enhance your capacity for retaining. Research findings show that correct recall was high after short intervals, such as 3 or 6 seconds, but by a 10 seconds interval, it was possible to recall only about 10 percent correctly. Now, let's move to the next slide. Findings suggest that the duration of STM, yes, short-term memory, was only about 6 to 12 seconds if unrehearsed, okay? Unrehearsed. We said that it's about 30 seconds, but when it's about 6 to 12 seconds, this case yes means that the stimuli or letters or any stimuli, yes, unrehearsed, sorry. Gradually, the information is decayed and forgetting takes place. This is called the trace decay theory of forgetting. The second theory of forgetting is what? Interference theory, which occurred when other material interfered with memorization. Okay, memorization. The first is trace decay theory, because what the stimuli aren't rehearsed, yes, and not repeated for human beings, then forgetting will be occurred. Long-term memory. This relates to the ability to retain information over almost indefinite period of time, because information will be kept in long-term memory forever. No limited duration, no limited for the time or period of time to the availability, of long-term memory. There seems to be no known limits to the duration or to the capacity of long-term memory storage, and the capacity is very high capacity to keep a lot of information, indefinite kinds and amount of information will be stored here in long-term memory. Here the representation forms, of retaining information and stimuli that are kept in long-term memory is the first understanding of meanings. All kinds of knowledge and beliefs, objects, events, people, places, plans, and skills are stored in LTM. Things, yes, are kept here in long-term memory. The question here, why information or stimuli, are kept for long time here, or the duration is indefinite. Why? Because long-term memory involves extra profound processing. Okay, extra and profound processing, strong processing, strong strategies, a profound operation here. Then the result is what? Long-term memory, such as organizing, the process of the duration for information to be existed and kept in short-term memory is around around 30 seconds, around 1 minute. This means that around 1 minute, so that findings suggest that the duration of STM was only about 6 to 12. In what case? In the case of unrehearsed for information or unrehearsing for information, no repeating, no rehearsal processes, no control process. Okay, then the yes, then the retaining for information will be less than 30 seconds. Gradually, the information is decayed and forgetting takes place. Here, there is forgetting theories for information. The first theory is what? Trace decay theory. This theory or this case of forgetting occurs when what? When the information is decayed and forgetting takes place. The second theory of forgetting also occurred when other material interfered with memorization. This theory is called interference theory of forgetting. There is a new information or old information that that will interfere my stored information that are available in my memory. Now, as we said before, the duration about long-term memory, the ability to retain information over almost indefinite period of time, no limited time. There is indefinite period of time to the information to be kept in our long-term memory. Why? The reason is long-term memory make many profound processes. I will tell you at the following slides. That relates, yes, to the ability to retain information over almost indefinite period of time. There seems to be no limits to the duration or to the capacity of long-term memory storage. Also, the capacity of long-term memory is very high. Yes, big capacity for long-term memory. The representation forms for long-term memory are very vast and vary. All kinds of knowledge and beliefs, objects and events, people, places, plans, skills are stored in this LTM and understanding of meanings for any stimuli. This profound strategy, as I said, organizing process, for example, memory, association, yes, and rehearsal, breaking the information, chunking process into units are commonly used strategies to organize information, yes, to keep information profoundly and perfectly here in this kind of memory. Long-term memories are enduring through there is a problem. So there is a problem of remembering and retrieving the stored information at later time by expanding. Yeah. In other words, we feel sometimes that we cannot remember a lot of stimuli. Although these stimuli existed in our mind, the clue is using to the meaningful repetition. Then we can easily recall and use information from a long term or the long term memory. Yes, example, community members learn better about health extension packages when learning experiences are related to life. If a patient were not paying attention to what a nurse is saying, perhaps because he is weary or distracted, it would be more useful to repeat the explanation at another time when the patient is more receptive and attentive. Yes, this is repetition or repeating, rehearsal to retain information and explanation in a good and proper condition for the patient. Now we have come to the end of our chapter with my wishes for success. Bye bye.